Mary was married to Chris, a devoted husband, a humble mechanic, and a pastor who loved God deeply. Their home was simple, but it was once filled with peace, prayer, and quiet joy. Every morning, before leaving for work, Chris would kneel and pray for his wife, asking God to protect her, guide her, and keep their marriage strong. By day, he worked long hours as a mechanic in Kumasi, fixing cars, earning honestly, and still finding time to serve faithfully as a pastor. But over time, Mary began to notice the lives of her close friends, the way they dressed, the cars they drove, the comfort they seemed to live in. Her friends, Rita and Florence, both pastors' wives, often spoke about their husbands in ways that made their lives sound effortless and luxurious. They didn't insult Chris directly, but their words carried comparison, and slowly, Mary began to measure her life against theirs. Love alone cannot give you the life you deserve, they would say, and those words began to settle deep in Mary's heart. One night, Mary watched Chris working late, trying to fix a car. But instead of seeing his sacrifice, she began to see his limitations. Chris would still come home tired, yet smiling, still gentle, still kind, still choosing to love her the only way he knew how. Mary responded, but her smile had changed. The love was still there, but now it was mixed with doubt and something unspoken. Rita and Florence showed her pictures of vacations, gifts, and perfect moments, carefully hiding the truth behind their lives. And slowly, without realizing it, Mary began to question her marriage, her husband, and the life she once believed was enough. At home, something had started to change. Mary was no longer as present as before. Her responses became shorter, her warmth slowly fading, even when Chris tried to reach her. Chris noticed the shift, and instead of arguing, he went to God. Late at night, he knelt alone, asking the Lord to help him understand what was happening to his wife. Meanwhile, Rita and Florence kept speaking, telling Mary how their husbands gave them money freely, paid for trips, and never let them lack anything. Mary didn't say much, but in her heart, she began to compare. The more she listened, the more her own life started to feel insufficient. Unaware of how deep the damage had gone, Chris quietly began saving money, little by little, planning to surprise Mary with something special from his heart. At dinner, the silence grew louder. Conversations became forced,
Mary,
and even simple moments together
we can't
started
keep
to
doing
feel
this.
heavy and uncomfortable.
I'm not hungry.
Mary became quieter, not out of peace, but distance. Her tone changed, her presence felt different, and the warmth between them began to disappear. Her friends didn't stop. In subtle ways, they mocked men like Chris. Pastors who preach faith but cannot provide comfort, they would say, laughing lightly. Chris could feel it. Something was wrong. But instead of reacting in anger, he remained gentle, choosing patience even as concern quietly grew in his heart. Mary began to withdraw emotionally, speaking less, engaging less, slowly pulling away from the man who had always stood by her. Yet, Chris did not change. He continued to care for her, to serve her, to love her, holding on to the vows he made before God. And slowly, what began as comparison turned into resentment. Mary no longer saw a faithful husband. She began to see a man who was not enough. After weeks of saving quietly, Chris came home with a small surprise. A dress and shoes he had carefully chosen for Mary, hoping to see her smile again. Mary opened the gift, looked at it, and instead of joy, her face remained unchanged. There was no excitement, only silence and disappointment. Then she spoke, not with gratitude, but frustration. She told him other men would have done far better, that this was not enough. Chris stood there, taking in every word. The pain was real, but he said nothing, choosing silence over anger and love over reaction. When she told her friends, they didn't correct her. They encouraged it, reminding her again that she deserved more than what Chris could offer.
You can't keep doing this.
When she told her friends, they didn't correct her. They encouraged it, reminding her again that she deserved more than what Chris could offer. Even then, Chris responded gently. He spoke with patience, reminding her of love, of faith, and of the life they were building together. But Mary's heart had shifted. She stopped going to church, saying she was tired of a life that felt like constant lack. Soon, the distance became physical. Mary moved into another room, creating space between them that words could no longer bridge. At church, people began to notice. They asked Chris where his wife was, but he only smiled gently, covering her with quiet dignity. At church, people began to ask questions. Where is Mary? But Chris never exposed her. As a pastor and a husband, he chose to cover her with honor, even in her absence. At home, the weight grew heavier. Chris cooked, cleaned, and took care of everything alone. Not because it was easy, but because he had made a covenant before God. Mary, on the other hand, had completely withdrawn. She ignored his words, his presence, even his efforts, as if the love he gave no longer mattered. The house that once held laughter and prayer became quiet, not peaceful, but empty. Two people under one roof, living like strangers. So Chris returned to the only place he could find strength. Night after night, he knelt in prayer, pouring his heart out to God in silence. And one night, in the stillness of that prayer, something shifted. His spirit became alert, as if God was about to reveal something deeper. The Holy Spirit opened his understanding, showing him that the problem was not just distance, but influence. Seeds had been planted through the voices around her. With care, Chris spoke to Mary. He told her what God had revealed, asking her to step away from the friendships that were pulling her heart away. But instead of listening, Mary responded with anger. She dismissed his words, insulted him again, and refused to believe anything was wrong. And in that moment, she shut the door on him, literally. The sound echoed through the house, marking the deepest point of their separation.
Even after everything, Chris did not stop loving her. He kept leaving small notes, gentle reminders that she was still his wife and still deeply loved.
Mary saw the messages, the notes, the kindness, but her heart had grown distant. She ignored them as if they no longer carried meaning.
Still, Chris remained consistent. He continued working hard as a mechanic and serving faithfully as a pastor, holding on to God even when nothing seemed to change.
Then one day, at the garage, everything began to shift. A man named Fred, a respected CEO, noticed Chris, not just for his skill, but for his character.
Fred watched closely. The honesty, the diligence, the humility, what others overlooked, he recognized, and it made a lasting impression. Soon, Fred approached him with an offer, a business partnership that could change his entire life. It was sudden, but it was significant. But Chris did not rush. Before making any decision, he went back to prayer, asking God if this opportunity was truly from Him. And in that place of surrender, God gave him peace, not confusion, not pressure, but a quiet assurance that this was the path prepared for him.
Then one day, Mary received a call that shook her. The police were asking about her friend Rita, mentioning an investigation involving church money and serious accusations. Mary stood frozen after the call. Her mind raced. Confusion, disbelief, fear. This was not the life Rita had been showing her. Desperate for answers, she went to Florence, only to discover a painful truth. Behind the quiet smiles, Florence had been hiding a troubled, abusive marriage. In that moment, everything became clear. The lives she envied were built on deception, and she had allowed those voices to destroy her own home. One day, Mary, broken and ashamed, returned home from an errand. Her heart was heavy, not just with regret, but with the realization of how deeply she had hurt her husband. Before she could say much, Chris pulled her into his arms. There was no anger, no rejection, only love that had remained even through the pain.
Through tears, Mary apologized, and Chris forgave her completely. In that moment, what had been broken began to heal, restored not by effort, but by grace. The next Sunday, they stood together in church once again. With humility, Mary shared her story, warning others not to listen to voices that pull them away from truth. And in time, God revealed His hand. Chris showed her the new business he had been blessed with, a reminder that what was once overlooked, God had chosen to honor. What the enemy meant for destruction, God turned into restoration. When love is rooted in Him, it never truly fails.